What happens when two of late night's biggest names sit down for what should be a friendly chat, but instead turns into an absolute disaster that ends with one of them storming off set in front of a shocked studio audience? It only took 36 seconds after one unbelievably disrespectful comment for the entire interview to completely fall apart. But before we get into this absolutely wild moment, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now because we're pulling back the curtain on Hollywood's dark side, exposing entitled celebrities and their shocking behavior the cameras never showed you. We've got the raw footage they don't want you to see, and you won't want to miss a single reveal. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think about this outrageous behavior. Now let's dive in. Jimmy Kimmel walked onto the Late Show set that night, expecting a normal interview. You know, the usual late-night host banter, some laughs, maybe talk about their shows, their families, just keeping things light and fun for the audience. That's what these interviews are supposed to be. Two colleagues in the same business, showing respect, having a good time. But what actually happened was something nobody in that studio could have predicted. Stephen Colbert was sitting behind his desk with that big smile he always has, and the audience was cheering as Jimmy walked out. They shook hands, Jimmy sat down in the guest chair, and everything seemed totally fine at first. The crowd was excited. These are two guys everyone knows and loves, right? So the energy in the room was really positive. Stephen started off with a question that seemed innocent enough. He said, "So Jimmy, thanks for coming on the show. I've been watching your show lately, and I have to ask, do you actually write any of your own material, or do you just read whatever your writers put in front of you?" Now, you could hear a few awkward laughs from the audience because that's kind of a weird way to start an interview. It's a little bit rude, but maybe he was joking around. Jimmy kind of chuckled, but you could tell he wasn't sure if Stephen was being serious or not. He said, "Well, I work with a team of incredibly talented writers, just like you do. That's how these shows work." But Stephen didn't let it go. He leaned back in his chair with this smug look on his face and said, Right, but I actually contribute to my writing room. I'm actually involved in the creative process. I was just wondering if you do the same, or if you're more of a puppet?" The audience got really quiet, like you could feel the tension immediately. That's not a joke, that's just mean. Jimmy's smile disappeared, and he sat up a little straighter. He said, "I'm sorry, are you actually asking me this right now? You think I just show up and read cards?" Stephen shrugged and said, "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, Jimmy. Your show has been pretty formulaic lately. It's the same thing every night. Maybe that's because you're not really putting yourself into it." Jimmy took a deep breath, and you could see he was trying to stay calm. He said, "Stephen, I've been doing this for over 20 years. I think I know how to run a talk show, and honestly, this is a pretty disrespectful way to treat a guest." But instead of backing off or apologizing, Stephen actually doubled down. He said, "Oh, come on, don't be so sensitive. I'm just having a conversation here. You can take a little criticism, can't you? Or is that too much for you?" The audience was barely making any noise now. A few people tried to laugh, but it just sounded uncomfortable. Jimmy looked directly at Stephen and said, "There's a difference between criticism and just being rude for no reason. I came here as your guest, and you're treating me like I'm some amateur who doesn't know what he's doing." Stephen waved his hand like he was brushing off Jimmy's words and said, "Maybe you are an amateur. Let's be honest. Your ratings have been slipping. People are getting bored of the same old Jimmy Kimmel routine night after night. When was the last time you did something actually interesting?" You could see Jimmy's jaw clench. He said, "My ratings are fine, Stephen. And even if they weren't, what does that have to do with anything? Why are you coming at me like this?" Stephen leaned forward with this really condescending expression and said, "I'm just trying to help you out, buddy. Maybe if you actually tried harder, put some real effort into your show instead of just coasting on your name, people would care more. But right now, it's just boring television." Jimmy shook his head and said, "Unbelievable. You know what? I don't need this. I don't need to sit here and listen to you trash me and my show for no reason." But Stephen wasn't done. He said, "Oh, so now you're going to run away? Can't handle a little honest feedback? That's pretty weak, Jimmy. I thought you were tougher than that." Jimmy stood up from his chair and said, "This isn't honest feedback, Stephen. This is you being a jerk because you think you're better than everyone else. I don't know what your problem is tonight, but I'm not going to sit here and be your punching bag." Stephen actually laughed and said, "There it is, the real Jimmy Kimmel. Can't take the heat, so you're going to storm off like a child. Very professional." The audience was dead silent now. Nobody knew what to do. This wasn't funny anymore. This was just two people having a real fight on live television. Jimmy pointed at Steven and said, "You want to talk about professional? You invited me on your show just to insult me. That's not professional. That's pathetic. And honestly, I feel sorry for you if this is how you get your kicks." Steven rolled his eyes and said, "Oh, please, spare me the moral high ground speech. You're just mad because someone finally called you out on your lazy work. Face it, Jimmy, you're not relevant anymore. Nobody cares about your show. You're yesterday's news." That was the moment everything broke. Jimmy's face went red and he said, "You know what? I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. You can sit here and talk to yourself." Steven said, "Fine, leave. Run away. That's what quitters do." Jimmy started walking toward the side of the stage and Steven called out, "Hey Jimmy, don't forget to have your writers come up with a good excuse for why you left. Oh wait, you probably can't even do that without their help." Jimmy stopped walking for just a second, turned around, and said, "The only excuse I need is that I don't waste my time with people who don't know how to treat others with basic respect. Good luck with your show, Steven. I hope your ego keeps you company." And then he walked off, just like that. Left the stage, left the building, left Steven sitting there behind his desk looking shocked that it had actually happened. The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay quiet. Most of them just sat there with their mouths open. Steven tried to recover. He said to the audience, "Well, that was interesting. I guess Jimmy couldn't handle a real conversation. We'll be right back after this break." But you could tell he was rattled. His voice was shaky and he wasn't smiling anymore. The camera cut away, but people in the audience later said that during the commercial break, Steven was talking to his producers and he looked really stressed out. His whole smug attitude had disappeared. When the show came back from commercial, Steven didn't mention Jimmy at all. He just moved on to the next segment like nothing had happened. But everyone watching knew something had happened. Social media exploded immediately. People were posting clips of the argument, talking about how uncomfortable it was, debating who was in the wrong. And here's the thing that really stood out to everyone watching. Jimmy had been nothing but respectful at the start. He came on the show ready to have a good time, ready to be a good guest, and Steven immediately went after him with personal attacks. Jimmy tried to stay calm, tried to defend himself without being mean back, but Steven just kept pushing and pushing. Jimmy never insulted Steven's show. He never attacked Steven personally. He just asked to be treated with basic respect. And when it became clear that wasn't going to happen, he made the decision to leave rather than sit there and take more abuse. That takes guts. That takes self-respect. A lot of people would have just sat there and tried to laugh it off, tried to pretend everything was fine, but Jimmy stood up for himself. He didn't let someone treat him badly just because they were on television. He showed that there are limits to what you should tolerate, even in a professional setting. Steven, on the other hand, came across as someone who thought he could say whatever he wanted without consequences. He was the host. He had the power in that situation, and he used it to try to tear down his guest. That's not what a good host does. A good host makes their guests feel welcome, makes them look good, has fun with them. Steven did the opposite. The whole thing started because Steven decided to question Jimmy's talent and work ethic right out of the gate. Instead of asking about fun stuff or interesting projects, he went straight for insults. And when Jimmy pushed back, Steven acted like Jimmy was the problem for not just sitting there and taking it. Think about what Steven said. He called Jimmy a puppet. He said Jimmy's show was boring and formulaic. He said Jimmy wasn't relevant anymore. He said nobody cared about Jimmy's show. He called Jimmy a quitter and said he was yesterday's news. Those aren't jokes. Those are just mean things to say to someone, especially someone who came on your show as a favor. And the way Steven said it all was so condescending. He acted like he was doing Jimmy a favor by being honest, but really he was just being cruel. There's a huge difference between constructive criticism and just tearing someone down to make yourself feel superior. Jimmy handled it way better than most people would have. He stayed pretty calm for most of the interview. He tried to explain that what Steven was doing was disrespectful. He gave Steven multiple chances to back off or apologize. But Steven kept going, kept pushing, kept insulting him. So when Jimmy finally left, it wasn't because he was weak or couldn't handle criticism. It was because he recognized that the conversation wasn't going anywhere good and that his time and dignity were worth more than sitting there being insulted on national television. The audience reaction told you everything you needed to know. They started out excited and happy, and by the end they were silent and uncomfortable. They could tell something was really wrong. This wasn't entertainment. This was just sad. People in the audience later said they felt bad for Jimmy. They said it was obvious that Steven was being way out of line and that Jimmy was trying his best to keep things civil. Some people said they lost respect for Steven that night because of how he acted. And you have to think about the fact that this was all happening in front of cameras, in front of a live studio audience, with millions of people watching at home. Steven knew all of that, and he still chose to treat his guests that way. What does that say about him? Jimmy could have fought back harder. He could have started insulting Steven's show or making personal attacks. But he didn't. He took the high road. He just said he wasn't going to be treated that way, and he left. That's class. The whole argument lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt longer because of how intense it was. Every time it seemed like maybe they could move past it, Steven would say something else that was insulting or dismissive. He wouldn't let it go. He kept poking and prodding, trying to get a reaction. When Steven called Jimmy a quitter as he was leaving, that was just cruel. Jimmy wasn't quitting anything. He was choosing not to participate in something that was harmful and disrespectful. That's not quitting. That's having boundaries. And that last comment Steven made about Jimmy needing his writers to come up with an excuse, that was Steven trying to get the last word in, trying to make himself feel like he won something. But he didn't win. He just showed everyone watching what kind of person he could be when he decided to be mean. Jimmy's response was perfect though. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just calmly stated that he doesn't waste time with people who don't know how to treat others with respect. And he wished Steven good luck with his show. Even while walking away from a terrible situation, Jimmy was more gracious than Steven had been the entire interview. The fact that Steven looked so shocked when Jimmy actually left shows that he didn't think there would be real consequences for his behavior. He thought he could say whatever he wanted and Jimmy would just sit there and take it because that's what guests are supposed to do. But Jimmy proved him wrong. This whole situation could have been avoided so easily. If Steven had just been a normal, decent host, they could have had a fun interview. They could have talked about their shows, shared funny stories, made the audience laugh. Instead, Steven chose to be hostile from the very first question. Nobody knows exactly why Steven acted that way. Maybe he was having a bad day. Maybe there's some behind-the-scenes tension between them that we don't know about. Maybe he thought it would be funny or edgy to roast his guest. Whatever the reason, it backfired completely. The interview became famous for all the wrong reasons. Instead of being remembered as a fun moment between two late-night hosts, it's remembered as the time Stephen Colbert was so rude to Jimmy Kimmel that Jimmy walked off the show. That's Stephen's legacy from that night. Jimmy, on the other hand, is remembered for standing up for himself and not tolerating disrespect. People respected him more after this happened because he showed that he has principles and boundaries. He showed that fame and success don't mean you have to let people treat you badly. Think about how uncomfortable everyone in that studio must have been. The producers, the camera operators, the audience members, everyone. They all had to watch this train wreck happen in real time and couldn't do anything to stop it. That's on Steven for creating that situation. The worst part is that Steven had complete control over how that interview went. He's the host. He asks the questions. He sets the tone. He could have made it a great interview, but he chose to make it terrible instead. And when it fell apart, he tried to blame Jimmy for leaving instead of taking responsibility for his own behavior. After Jimmy left, Steven tried to play it off like it was no big deal, like Jimmy was just being oversensitive. But everyone could see through that. The damage was done. People saw what happened. They saw who was the aggressor and who was just trying to defend themselves. This is a perfect example of what happens when someone with power decides to abuse that power. Steven had the platform. He had the audience. He had the home field advantage, and he used all of that to try to make his guests look bad. But it backfired because people aren't stupid. They can tell the difference between playful teasing and genuine meanness. Jimmy's decision to walk off sent a clear message. I don't care who you are or where we are, I'm not going to let you disrespect me. That's a message more people need to hear and internalize. You don't have to stay in situations where you're being treated poorly, even if leaving is awkward or uncomfortable. The silence from the audience during the worst parts of the argument was deafening. These are people who came to a comedy show expecting to laugh and have fun, and instead they got to witness a real conflict between two famous people. That's not what they signed up for. Looking at everything Steven said during that interview, it's hard to find a single moment where he was genuinely kind or respectful to Jimmy. From start to finish, he was either insulting Jimmy directly or making condescending remarks. That's not how you treat a guest. That's not how you treat another human being. Jimmy gave him so many chances to change course. Every time Steven said something rude, Jimmy pushed back, but also gave him an opportunity to apologize or move on to something else. But Steven never took those opportunities. He just kept going harder with the insults. The moment that really sealed it was when Steven said nobody cares about Jimmy's show and that he's yesterday's news. That's not criticism, that's just trying to hurt someone's feelings. And for what? What did Steven gain from saying that? Nothing except showing his true colors. When Jimmy finally stood up and said he was done, you could hear in his voice that he meant it. He wasn't bluffing or trying to get an apology. He was genuinely finished with the conversation and ready to leave. That's what happens when you push someone too far. Steven's attempt to call Jimmy weak for leaving was such a transparent attempt to save face. He realized he'd gone too far and Jimmy was actually going to walk out, so he tried to make it seem like leaving was somehow the wrong choice. But everyone watching knew the truth. The real courage that night came from Jimmy. It takes courage to walk away from a bad situation, especially when you're on camera and you know people will have opinions about it. But he did it anyway because he knew it was the right thing to do for himself. This interview shows exactly why respect matters, even in entertainment. Even when you're trying to be funny or entertaining, you still need to treat people with basic human decency. Steven forgot that or chose to ignore it, and the result was an absolute disaster that nobody enjoyed watching. The crazy thing is that this could have been such an easy, fun interview. Two successful talk show hosts hanging out, sharing stories, maybe giving each other some friendly ribbing. Instead, it became this dark, uncomfortable moment that people still talk about. Jimmy's final words to Steven were actually pretty generous, considering how he'd been treated. He could have said much worse things. He could have really gone after Steven, but he just said he doesn't waste time with people who don't treat others with respect. And he wished Steven good luck. Even in anger, he was classier than Steven had been all night. The way Steven's voice shook when he came back from commercial showed that even he knew he'd messed up badly. He tried to act normal, but you could tell he was shaken. The smugness was gone. The confidence was gone. He'd pushed too hard and lost his guest, and now he had to deal with the aftermath. This whole situation is a reminder that actions have consequences. Steven thought he could say whatever he wanted without any real repercussions, but Jimmy proved him wrong by leaving. Sometimes the consequence of treating people badly is that they stop being around you. For everyone watching at home, this was a masterclass in how not to conduct an interview and how to respond when someone disrespects you. Steven showed us what not to do as a host. Jimmy showed us how to stand up for yourself with dignity. The fact that we're still talking about this moment shows how impactful it was. People remember when someone gets treated unfairly, and they remember when someone stands up for themselves. This interview had both of those elements in full force. Steven created a hostile environment from the first question and maintained it throughout the entire conversation. He never once tried to make Jimmy feel welcome or comfortable. He never tried to have an actual conversation. He just attacked and attacked until his guest had enough and left. Jimmy's patience during most of the interview was actually remarkable. He answered questions. He tried to explain his perspective. He attempted to keep things civil, but there's only so much anyone can take, and Steven found Jimmy's limit. The audience's discomfort was palpable through the whole thing. You could feel how much they wanted this to stop, how much they wished someone would step in and change the subject, but it just kept getting worse until Jimmy finally ended it by leaving. This interview will probably be studied in media classes as an example of how an interview can go completely wrong when one person decides to be hostile. It's a cautionary tale about the importance of respect and professionalism. In the end, Jimmy Kimmel walked off that stage with his dignity intact. He didn't let Stephen Colbert's bad behavior change who he was or how he conducted himself. He stayed true to his values, even when it would have been easier to just sit there and take it. And that's why, when people look back at this moment, they see Jimmy as the good guy who stood up for himself against a host who forgot what hospitality means.